Good afternoon, everyone. This is our new research series from Creature. I'm Wesley, Professor of Transcultural Arts and Design from the School of Art, Architecture and Design, and the Director of Creature. I will moderate this session. A warm welcome to all of you. And please be reminded that we are recording the session. You will find the recording following today's event on our Creature website. We ask the audience to mute yourself and switch off your camera to avoid interference with the signal. The chat box is not working due to a technical error, unfortunately, but please reserve your questions for the Q&A time towards the end of the session. The Transcultural Exchanges and Network research strand of Creature convenes Reorienting Cultural Creativity, a research series on the tactics of resistance in institutionalized establishments and postcolonial processes of globalization. In an attempt to add new prospects and visions to the existing setup of art and design, the series readdresses the balance for an actor-oriented approach. The research series brings together art, design, cultural historians, curators, artists, and researchers in humanities whose work concerns art and culture, museology, and the cultural and creative industry in asymmetric societies of postcoloniality. Today's event is conceived in collaboration with Africa Fashion's Research Institute and Creature. We co-hosted with our university BAME network through Black History 365. African Fashion Research Institute was founded in 2019 by Dr. Erica de Greef and Lesiba Mabitsela, and serve as a research, archival, and curatorial platform dedicated to the development and decolonization of African fashion discourse, bringing African fashion research communities, histories, and aesthetics to diverse local and global audiences. Thank you for joining us from the Hailstorm Cape Town, Erica and Lesiba, and a warm welcome to both of you. We are also very delighted to have two respondents to Erica's and Lesiba's presentation. James Hunting is an educator and artist. His areas of interest are focused on the intricacies and questions of identities, belonging, including othering and being, interlinked with desire and issues around the relevance of making. He is the co-director of our BA Textile Fashion. Kevin Brosen is a learning and educational development practitioner, supporting early career academics transitioning into teaching and learning from the creative industries. He is also a member of BAME Voice Staff Network Committee at London Metropolitan University and co-founder of Launch Academics, a movement of activists, creatives, academics, and students committee to creating critical digital content in the form of podcasts and academic mixtapes, exploring themes such as decolonizing education, critical pedagogies, and disrupting industry through digital content innovation. Thank you, James and Kevin, for taking part in our event. Erica and Lesiba will present us the making of Africa Fashion Studies through a range of projects led by African Fashion Research Institute, aiming to decolonize curricula and archives, address erasures and stereotypes, and explore the possibilities and affordances of the digital. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Erica for her presentation now.
Thank you very much, Wesley. Thank you for the introductions. And thank you for inviting us to start this really important and interesting research series called the Reorienting Cultural Creativity. So as Wesley already mentioned, Lesiba and I founded the African Fashion Institute in 2019, and really we founded this in a response to three kind of critical gaps that we identified. And the first great gap is this absence of African fashion histories in history books, in textbooks, in exhibitions, in museums, in archives. The second big gap was the kind of gap in understanding what fashion from the African continent really includes and excludes. And the third sort of great gap that we identified was really about these sort of limits to thinking about how African fashion could be seen in the future. So the kind of future imaginary of African fashion. So what I'm going to do today is really just share 5 of our kind of more public-facing projects. Obviously, in the last 2 years, we've kind of dealt with sort of logistics, setting up the African Fashion Research Institute, kind of inward-facing projects, some lecturing, mentorships, supervision, workshops, masterclasses. But I'm really going to just share 5 sort of public-facing projects in today's session, so that we can start to just unpack a little bit of what kind of key principles are that underpin the work of AFRI. And the first is really this idea of access. The second one is how we work with this idea of disruption, and disruption being a kind of necessary logic to work in the space of fashion studies. What are we disrupting, and the spaces that we're able to activate. Third sort of pillar in our work is really the digital, and so we're looking at digital not only as the digital platforms, but also the digital as a mode of making. And then the last is this idea of fashion as a lens, and particularly a kind of critical lens. So it was really in 2018 that Lesiba and I started our journey collaboratively, exploring what would then eventually become AFRI. So the exhibition 21 Years Making Histories with South African Fashion Week was the first dedicated fashion exhibition curated at the Zayat Museum of Contemporary African Art in Cape Town. So in conjunction with this exhibition, Lesiba and I convened a series of workshops and talks as part of the exhibition's public programming. And so really quite carefully trying to think, how do we bring in different kinds of voices into what would normally be quite an exclusionary space, like the idea of a museum of contemporary African art and the kind of mechanisms that exclude certain kinds of voices. So the public programming was really quite clearly developed to engage with notions of access, but also thinking about disruptions, and we were quite careful to think about how an exhibition on African fashion comes with very particular stereotypes and visitor expectations. So working against the kind of sort of exoticization and the kind of limits of presenting African fashion, but also just working against that sort of easy assumption of a chronology. So also thinking around African ontologies in different kinds of ways, and the way in which we composed or curated this particular exhibition. So ideas of disruption and access were really quite key to our sort of founding work there. Shortly after that, so early in 2019, was our second curatorial project, and this was Fashioning Brave New Worlds, Africa at the International Fashion Showcase in 2019. The project, Fashioning Brave New Worlds, foregrounded the work of 3 African designers at the International Fashion Showcase. The first was Thebe Magugu from South Africa, the second was Cedric Mizero from Rwanda, and the third was Amidoshi Shah from Kenya. And so these 3 designers showcased at the International Fashion Showcase together with 16 other emerging designers. These designers included designers from Lithuania, Brazil, Vietnam, Canada, Italy, Colombia, and more. But what was really quite important for us is the International Fashion Showcase showed in London for 2 weeks to an audience that excluded the communities and the origins of these designers, many of which were from the global south. So this was the Fashioning Brave New World was also the first digital fashion exhibition on the African continent. So we were kind of compelled, in a way, compelled and inspired to render this exhibition as VR. so as to return the project to viewers on the continent via the digital. And in this way, we've provided not only virtual and free access to the entire exhibition, but also contributed with further layers for critical engagement through interviews led by AFRI with designers Cedric and Ami, as well as sort of adding another layer of archival footage. And I just want to share with you a short little video clip here that looks at the kind of layering that we were able to add into this digital exhibition.
Creative inclinations, and then went to university in the UK and pursued like a degree in jewelry and silversmithing from the School of Jewelry in Birmingham, but then ended up working in advertising for almost 12 years, just to be able to make some money.
Nice.
And then came back to, I suppose, started my career again in design and making and creating jewelry about 5 years ago. Yeah. So it's been about 5 years. And it's grown very kind of organically, and I mean, being at IFS has been quite a incredible kind of experience. So yeah.
Do you want to maybe explain a little bit about what your installation was about?
So I think we did some research. I think we kind of discovered that the Somerset House was actually, and the West Wing itself, was actually the home of the UK Salt Office from 1702 to 1798. And essentially was responsible for collecting colony and domestic and colony taxes on salt. And we started thinking about salt as being kind of this universal kind of mineral and material that's like essential for life, but then also started thinking about it as a commodity and a currency. And also kind of this story of power and submissions started really, I suppose, really started kind of solidifying and becoming quite strong.
Do you want to...
And so this kind of layering of a narrative on top of the exhibition allowed us to embed new kinds of stories into the African fashion exhibition. And these kinds of engagements with designers and the digital sort of expanded the possibility of thinking about how do we expand the work that we're doing with other partners, with other communities, and with other on other platforms. And so this led to a number of sort of collaborations, working together with designers, with other researchers, who then helped to co-create and co-author projects. And the kind of sort of interdisciplinarity is really important part of this process. So as a research, archival and curatorial platform committed to decolonizing African fashion discourses, we developed a 7-week intensive course called African Fashion with a Question Mark. And this course coheres around a series of provocations about what it means to fix the unthinkable in relation to African fashion, to kind of disrupt ongoing and oppressive limitations around stereotype and erasure. And then the kind of thinking through different kinds of polygynous African aesthetics and even diverse histories and ontologies. So the course really invites sort of quite speculative and audacious responses in a kind of multimedia way. And we're aiming to use the course to kind of speak to coalescing into new visual and shareable languages, and inviting questions around what makes fashion African, and to interrupt the kind of global fashion narratives that generally have sidelined the kind of creative expression that comes from the African continent. So if anybody is really interested in any of these projects, our website does give you links to these projects, and you can make some more inquiry. We're going to run the course again in June, and we're generally running this sort of course twice a year. It's a fully online course. So again, working with the digital to create that kind of access. And then the last two projects that I'm just going to touch on today are really two projects that were collaborative outcomes together with Lesiba Mabitsela's studio practice. And the first one was also located in and started during our time at Zayat's Museum of Contemporary African Art in a kind of response to the kind of principles and aesthetics that were being played out in a contemporary African art institution on the African continent. And these projects both follow Lesiba's master's thesis in theatre and performance, titled Performing Methods of Undress Towards a Reimagined Masculine Identity. And so there's a short video clip with a bit of a voiceover, and it will be take you through the project. And it really looks to highlight this much criticized notion of museums that claim for themselves an African identity.
Reinstitute. Definitions of what qualifies as clothing or the clothed from the unclothed vary from culture to culture and from era to era. These clashes in values have had lasting ramifications, particularly for the victims of European imperial ambitions, influencing both cultures and traditions. Citation Levine 2008. Fine art often promotes and praises images of the European nude through sculpture and paintings, whilst the nude body of the colonial other is often represented through what is perceived to be a scientific lens, and often in an inhumane manner. Citation Morel 2005 and Levine 2008. Remarkably, history continues to offer us clues as to how the naked body can become a useful tool of resistance or decolonization, with the image of Nelson Mandela and Mohandas Gandhi immediately coming to mind, substituting the suited figures accustomed to qualified lawyers for a traditional loincloth or a scantily draped body respectively. Coincidentally, the design of a stiff, structured aesthetic is mostly associated with the construction of suits, the institutions which they represent, multinational corporations, houses of parliament, the army et al., and a type of masculine performance characterized as Eurocentric, heterosexual, prejudiced, power-laden, corporate, at times violent, and often militaristic. In addition, the vocation of constructing particular garments for particular bodies via tailoring is gendered and mimics Judith Butler's reflections on gender as a construct. This intervention, titled Reinstitute, is built on a growing body of work and theories on performing methods of undress towards a reimagined African masculine identity. Drapery, which serves as both non-functional and functional aesthetic distinctions in the appearance and construction of male and female garments, is defined here as a method of undress, possessing the ability to reimagine the common suit. In this performance intervention, the artist explores how the performance of African institutionalism could alter if there was an ideological and conceptual shift in how suits are designed, constructed, and therefore presented. The artist has visited examples in the archive of fashion design to derive this question, particularly Bonnie English's Japanese fashion designers, the work and influence of Issey Miyake, Yohji Yamamoto and Reika Wakabo, published in 2011, and their influence on Western clothing traditions and silhouettes in the 1980s. In order to understand the complexities and entanglement of the above provocations, the artist has decided to construct alternative garments, made with the exact same materials traditionally associated with suits. These alternative garments are, however, non-form-fitting, heavily draped, and worn in the everyday, as acts of sartorial resistance.
the last project, really, just to wrap up these projects, is really an extension again of the work that Lesiba did start with Reinstitute and his thesis. And this project, called the Cutting Room Project, responds to South African architect Ilse Wolff and her research that looked at unstitching Rex Trueform. And Rex Trueform was a South African clothing manufacturing company in the Western Cape in the 1930s and 1940s. And she explored how this kind of really modernist building co-constructed very particular questions around race, class, and gender. And so Lesiba's research project again took this idea of the Western suit, and the way in which the Western suit very similarly encompasses many of the same sort of socio-political entanglements and very necessarily sort of inquiry into those kinds of oppressions of class and race and gender, in much the same way that the architecture of the Rex Trueform building was. So this is, again, it's a fully digital project. It was realized as part of the University of Cape Town's Institute for Creative Arts online festival in 2020. And working with vintage suits, excavating kind of voices and stories, and then layering these onto contemporary urban landscapes and bodies. The project explored the tangible nature of both materials and methods of fashion, and the accessibility of new multimedia platforms to address erasure and disruption, particularly around contemporary heritage practices. So these projects as a whole seem to then sort of start to take on often, an extended life, and slowly we've been building up a kind of community of research associates that we collaborate with and kind of continue in our research work. And just very briefly, a page of our fantastic and fabulous associates and collaborators and partners in our work. So thinking about archives, thinking about museums, thinking about educational exchanges, thinking about sort of cultural entrepreneurship and course development, curriculum, and archives. So together with slowly building up a network of collaborators and partners, some local partners, the Research Collective for Decolonizing Fashion, the Sustainability Project, an Art Meets app. And so together, we're hoping to, in time to come, develop and expand the work that the African Fashion Research Institute has started. And just to summarize, again, this idea that, these four key principles that we've been working with in terms of accessibility, this idea to work disruptively, the incredible sort of decolonial affordances of the digital, and then, the lens through which fashion allows us to critique and investigate questions of culture, race, class, future, memory, history, and all the rest. So I think I'm going to leave you with that and leave it over to Lesiba and James and Kevin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erica. That's absolutely fascinating. And without further ado, I think that Lesiba is going to follow on some of the elaboration of the project. So I'd rather not interrupt at that point. So I'll pass it on to Lesiba immediately now. Lesiba, you're mute.
Apologies, can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting us. Very happy to answer any questions about what work we're doing. So yeah, take it away, Kevin and James.
Gosh, that was a fast one. That was a fast turnaround. I was just settling down to listen to some more. Well, hello, everybody. amazing presentation. Thank you. Very exciting stuff and very important stuff. It's not just exciting, it's important. And personally, I can't wait for building and collaborative projects and future between us. I'm the course leader of textiles and fashion textiles here at London Metropolitan, and incredibly interested in the notion of disruption and challenging bit that I'm interested in, and it was the language that you were using in the presentation, which I really appreciated, wasn't the language of inclusion and exclusion, which I think is continued erasure, but the language of recognition, and the recognition of other does not erase identity and individuality. And I thought that's what we try and base within our educational experience that we offer, is that everybody is recognized or is enabled to be recognized. I feel that one of the things that I was very conscious, I'm going to lay myself bare here as well, because it needs to be an honest conversation. And I think one of the things I'm very aware of is that there can be a Western insistence on students from African heritage celebrating this fact. And the language can very quickly come into, but you really should look at your own background, you should do this. And then that immediately is a colonial aspect, and it becomes into ideas of success. And if I don't do this, will my knowledge be recognized? And it's about allowing the space for students to explore and validate if they so wish. So it's all about the individual creating their own choices and using whatever they want to use, and recognizing cultural capital is very different. And as an academic, one of my most interesting, I suppose, focus points within teaching, particularly the subject, is how do we disrupt academic knowledge, and how we acknowledge knowledge, and how we recognize knowledge. And knowledge is very different, and most higher education knowledge within the UK is based on very sort of colonial attitudes and rules. Let's call them rules. And what we try and do is, as academics, we try and embrace that we don't know, but we can learn. And if we learn together and we learn from people with other knowledge, then knowledge becomes a growing and living entity that creates a decolonial approach, because we are not coming with the rules, coming with the gatekeeping. We are opening the gates and looking in a different way. One of the things we have done in a more sort of specific point was, within our course, we've started on a process of something we're calling hearing the unheard and seeing the unseen, because we were looking at students and how research happens and how ideas happen within projects. And you suddenly very quickly realize, when you look at that, that the pool of knowledge is already very erased. So there's an awful lot of people who aren't there. So what we're trying to encourage our students to do is to carry out research, carry out the academic processes of design development, but look at who isn't there. Look at who people know individually or know from other ways, other sources, and bring them in. And the more we can share them, the more the bases of knowledge and history get bigger, and the more representation happens without being focused upon happening. And I think excuse my language if it's wrong here, and I'm trying not to say things wrongly, but I really feel that within the textile environment, which is within the West very exclusionary, we have to acknowledge we don't know, and we have to acknowledge we want to learn, and then we have to learn from people who do know. And that's when we have to accept that knowledge is different. And we learn that through listening and watching and talking, and getting things very wrong and getting things very right. And I thought that the project you mentioned earlier, which is the online project, what was fantastic about that, and I probably will get the language wrong here again, so apologize me, but one of the things that really struck me was it takes the lived experience as the baseline, and that allows imagination to run riot. Whereas what can happen within the West, when we think we're doing the right thing, is we already see Africa, which is a very big word, as a disruptive starting point, which kind of limits the imagination, because we're already working within these colonial attitudes of what Africa represents to us all. So I thought what was fantastic was this it's challenging the norms and what is a norm. And that's what I feel is the most important for the West gatekeepers and academic traditionalists, and I am going to use that word, who don't want to disrupt, need to acknowledge that disruption is academic, and disruption is developmental, and it is true educational pedagogy to challenge what we do. And there is a real fear of that, and it's a fear of challenging our own knowledge. When we say we don't know, does that other us? Who cares? I mean, I'm all for othering everybody, but then we recognize that everybody's different. So anyway, I just wanted to say what we how we approach it, and touching it. This is such a huge subject; it could go on for hours, and I'd love to be in a proper dialogue with everybody so we can really exchange thoughts. But I just want to present what I was thinking at the moment, and I think the collaborative future is so important, and the digital future is necessarily important, but we mustn't also exclude digital poverty, which can then exclude other people as well. So there's lots of conversation to have, but I really look forward to working with you in the future. And I'm going to pass you over to Kevin now, because I don't want to outspeak, and I'm sure some of you people listening have also got questions. So thank you very much for listening, and I do hope that there was some sense to be made of what I said. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, James, for that. Yeah, James, I think what I'm about to say is going to echo a lot of what's already kind of been said by you, actually. But first, let me just start by, out of courtesy, say thank you to Erica and Lesiba for, first for the great work that you're doing at AFRI. And secondly, let me thank Professor Wesley Ling for inviting me along to participate in this much needed dialogue about the development of a decolonial focus, exploring African fashion studies. So let me just say, for myself, given my immediate context as a learning developer, and also as the founder of the Lounge Academics platform and podcast, and also as a representative of the Black History Month 365 planning team, a constant running theme for me, and I think this definitely was sparked by your work, is the theme of dialogue. And James has just hit on that just recently as well, particularly when it comes to hearing the authentic custodian voices of African history and the diaspora. I mean, for myself, I'm often frustrated by the erasure, the misinformation, and the silences of voices that often go unheard, and obviously is a byproduct of the colonial project. But with that said, though, your work has left me infused and energized, because I like the way that it embodies resistance. It creates that thought leaderships and creates new opportunities for insights. And I think the question that you've posed about what indeed is fashion, African fashion, I think is very apt for this whole dialogue around this. And I second James in the need for us to have a wider dialogue with our students and with the broader communities around this very topic as well. The question for me sparks hope, though, for dialogue, but equally presents the tensions of opposition from the dialectic, to the decolonial kind of narratives of African fashion and our diverse African ontologies. And actually, we can't deny the legacy of the colonial project and its influence and how it represents knowledge, and particularly of African fashion, to the rest of the world. This need for access and the issue of access, I feel, obviously is a global struggle. This raises tensions, in pedagogy and praxis, and our pursuit for kind of disrupting this discourse by enabling access to these decolonial voices and approaches are often seen as obviously new terrain. We often are the ones that are having to set the new trends in that way and embark on these new journeys. But with that comes obviously the risk and the danger of the harsh critique that often comes, from the colonial gaze, invalidating what is seen to be, true knowledge. And that's always there. That's something we're always having to navigate. This is an issue that I grapple with as part of my own research and my work. And moreover, I think your work raises pertinent questions and new opportunities that can be afforded by the digital in enabling that access that I feel goes beyond critical engagement and actually can tap into new hearts and minds. And I think it's very important for us to think about, for a lot of people, you know, we don't necessarily want to be burdened with, you know, as James alluded to, the celebration of this fact of new beginnings with the decolonial lens of African fashion, but being present and just being, to recognizing the new, particularly given the strength of that decolonial lens and these narratives that exist. So, you know, I hope that this opens the door not only for intercultural communication and dialogue, but also for transdisciplinary dialogue as well, which further kind of, you know, speaks to the threads of what's happening, and what exists. So for me, I like the fact that we are exploring the creation of digital content such as podcasts, publications, and I'm kind of keen to see what your future plans are in how, you know, this content can be represented and developed further, and particularly when centering around the decolonial voices of African fashion. You speak of 4 principles, you know, particularly around access, you know, digital, fashion, and disruption. But I would like to welcome you to also consider a kind of a 5th principle around the dialogic as well, as your body of works has an ability to stimulate internal and intercultural dialogue, which I find is very profound. So I'm curious to learn more about the potential for this dialogue and the exchange of ideas, and how we can extend this to kind of global partners and activists who are also a part of this shared struggle. So for me, I know here in the UK, I'm aware from my own platform, having interviewed one of the directors of CAIAD, you know, the Costume Institute of the African Diaspora. I think both entities would make for a great collaborative exchange of knowledge and ideas. And I'm sure there are many more to mention as well. So ideas for disruption and critical engagement can really only exist in a dialogic space, you know, between kind of serious questions and serious answers. For an idea to be, for me, or to come to existence means for it to be communicated dialogically. When dialogue ends, everything ends. So with this in mind, you know, Lesiba and Erica, I thank you for your sharing and your offering. I, for me, have a number of questions that I've listed here for us to consider. One of which was to kind of think about, you know, what has been the resistance to your efforts at AFRI in presenting, you know, the decolonial narrative of African fashion. I'm sure there'll be kind of colleagues as part of this conversation who will also kind of identify and share this struggle also. But in addition, who have been the antagonists and the saboteurs to your efforts, and how have they informed the development of AFRI's mission and objectives? So even in our pursuit to foster critical dialogue, sometimes the very voices that we seek to elevate can become our harshest critics. And this can be for several reasons. So I just would like us to kind of spend some time to consider that if we're able to. I'm also aware that you have collaborated with local partners, organizations and individuals, and, you know, what are the opportunities, you know, through the shared disruption with global allies also committed to decolonizing African fashion, and what would this collaboration look like? How will you enable further access through the digital? What are your plans? I know we've heard some of them already, Erica, as you've mentioned the app, but it'd be great to hear about the further development of this digital content and the forms that they'll take. And once again, you know, what are the questions that are posed around this kind of shared struggle in enabling that dialogue? So for me, you know, in closing, I just really invite everyone that's on this call to kind of really consider Erica and Lesiba's work at AFRI, and how this may have, you know, impacted your hearts and minds. Be generous, be very generous with your offerings and responses and questions, and let's keep that dialogue flowing. So on behalf of the Black History Month 365 team, the BAME Voice Staff Network, and founder of the Lounge Academics platform, I thank you for your attentive ears. So thanks.
So if I may, if that's fine with you, maybe there was just a little bit of a confusion in terms of what I was supposed to do at this point. But anyways, it's just a response to the 2 comments from James and Kevin. And I thought maybe just to touch on a few of the things that you've mentioned, if that's fine. I've written down some notes and maybe some of the questions that probably the guests want to have answered might pop up. But I was really drawn to what James talked about in terms of how to involve students to bring in their own stories. And I think maybe I can only speak from my personal journey from high school, I guess, up until where I am today, but also speak to the journey or the process where I have now where I'm in the position of taking care of an intern. And the same sorts of questions or the same sorts of instances seem to pop up around this idea of perception and perception of our own stories. I do know that I always tell Erica that I find myself in a very fortunate position because I did fine arts in high school. I also did history in high school. And so I already had that sort of backing when I went into doing fashion design. But also I was very eager to kind of try and figure out what was our Japan story. And that's probably where that kind of took me in terms of what do we have as Africans that we can be proud of? And so, essentially when we do kind of try and teach our students or how do we get students involved, it's first with the student in mind. But also, you've got to also look at the curricula and expected outcomes of the lesson. And how do those expected outcomes hinder a truly decolonial process of sharing knowledge? The other thing is, my intern is very much a top student in her class. She's so focused on not failing. And so for her, the question, her importance are, to maintain her A average. And for me, that's something that I see as a red flag, because I wouldn't have been able to do these projects without failure. And failure just by the sheer fact that you are challenging the knowledge. Failure based on the fact that you are taking an alternative route. And so these are the questions that maybe I've come to think about as James was talking, is that what is the particular agencies of the students that are being taught or that take up the courses, but at the same time, what is the agency of the institution that you are teaching under, and what is the agency of the teacher as well? I think there's an important factor that a teacher, or an important role that a teacher plays, not just as someone who is doing a job, but also as a practitioner, because we'd expect that the teacher themselves have some sort of knowledge in what they're teaching, and therefore, if we have teachers who are not necessarily that involved in that sort of decolonial sort of history and practice, and who are not necessarily ready to do the work, then the outcomes are probably limited in terms of those areas. I was fortunate enough to have one teacher that was not necessarily part of the main staff, and therefore she was, I guess, on the side street, as Yohio Momota likes to say, about his practice. But she kept on pushing me. She kept on saying that I shouldn't lower my standards, and I guess that comes across in terms of areas of research and my obvious fascination with Japanese fashion and its influence on the world going forward. With that being said, I mean, it's very much the idea of the victor tells the story, right? And that's why we, as the African Fashion Institute or Research Institute, together with other theorists from around the globe, kind of speak to notions of decolonial thesis, are trying to bring into the conversation multiple storylines as opposed to a singular storyline that kind of is conveyed throughout the fashion landscape, specifically as well with this idea of a singular modern idea or modern sort of outlook in terms of design, in terms of taste. And so what we're trying to do is bring multiple sorts of theories into this space. What was happening or during the process of, or what has decolonial or coloniality retarded? And that's what my one history teacher would say. What has coloniality retarded in terms of the process or the progress of a unique story where fashion is concerned within the African continent, but it also allows us to kind of speak to multiple areas, not just stories, but, you know, where are we allowed to speculate as well? And, you know, especially in the world of academia, it's almost as though it's a no-go to speculate. And so with practice, and this is why I'm so much an advocate for physical or practical work, is that you are encouraged to create or to speculate. And that's where some of the most interesting sort of processes have come from, or insights have come from as well. And maybe some thoughts in terms of the backbones of the work that I do is obviously because of the theatre and performance background, but you know, you learn about theatre of the oppressed, or the pedagogy of the oppressed by Augusta Ball, and you know, all of those stories kind of come into the work. The idea of dispelling hierarchy, the idea of collaborating, the idea of using theatre or performance to speak through your clothes, but also to speak through life lessons or theories that, you know, can guide how our practice has gone, and which has been the basic blocks of our practice for a long time. So yes, thank you very much for having us here. I'm happy to respond to any questions that you may have around my work. Also part of AFRI's work as well.
Thank you. I know that James, is it James, has hands been up for a while, so I suppose they probably want to respond to your response, Lesiba. James, are you here?
I am, just very, very quickly, because I think everything that's been said is so important and really relevant. It's one of your comments about how is knowledge looked at in things. One of the things I found is there has been a whole focus on reflection within academia, and particularly in creative practice, about reflection, but reflection has always been taken as written. And what I've learned in textiles, and what I'm learning in textiles has a language in itself of making, and that is reflective whilst it's being made. So we are opening up how we acknowledge success, and I hate the word success, and I love the word failure. I mean, we focus the whole of our degree on failure, because failure is when you learn and when you disrupt. And failure is also a very interesting concept. But reflection itself has become something which isn't a task, but it's something people acknowledge that they do. And I think we are trying to make our students acknowledge their practice that is happening at all times. And we are trying to almost say to them, this is a thing. What you are doing is a thing, and you might not feel it's a thing because it's written as something that excludes you and you're not doing it how you think you should be doing it, but you are doing a thing. Anyway, I just want to say we are working around this, and it's a conversation I'd love to continue with you because it is so important. Thank you. Other people speak, otherwise I'll keep going on.
Thank you, James. That's a very exciting discussion. I'm sure that, well, there'll be a lot more that you would like to go on for more hours of discussion, but I also am aware of the time, and I know that some audience may like to ask some questions, so I've actually had some questions myself, so but certainly I would give my chance to the audience first, and if I have time then I would ask my question. Hannah, you have to help me, because with my computer I never know who is raising the hand. Am I right that that's one hand raising, and who is that?
Harriet McKay was first up, and then
okay, Harriet, please.
Hi,
Hi everyone. How great to hear from you all, colleagues in London and colleagues in Cape Town. I think what I wanted to say was more of a sort of observation than a question, and it comes in several parts actually. First of all, thinking about pedagogy, thinking about disruption, thinking about decoloniality. In the first instance, thinking about pedagogy and disruption, one of the things that I'm really interested in and working on South Africa is just telling my students, trying to communicate to them the fact that just to be creative and to be working in art and design, even 30 years into democracy, is in a way an act of significant disruption, given the history of art and design education in South Africa. So that's something that I think is really an interesting thing to take on board, that this was not prioritized prior to democracy. So any act of creativity is something that already sets up a kind of challenge at whatever level, whether it's a primary school kid or whether it's different forms of design and making. So there's that kind of pedagogic history, which I think is really, really interesting in the South African situation, as I understand it. And then the other issue is coming to these conversations and trying to kind of talk about disruption and get away from the colonial project. I think we have to kind of, for me, I realize I have to acknowledge that it's what we're talking about very often is still massively dogged by issues of colonialism and appropriation. For example, I'm thinking about Laduma Nkokolo's designs and disruptions and thinking about menswear, and then along comes Eddie Murphy, and coming to America too, where Makosa designs are written through the film, or trying to explain Basuta blankets to a student recently, and they said, oh yeah, Black Panther. So there's another, there's this kind of continuing kind of exoticization of Africa in popular culture. And actually, it's important for me to acknowledge that if a student knows the Black Panther films and that's where they've understood those blankets from, well, that's okay in a way, because at least they're kind of recognizing the object. So it's working away from, but also acknowledging the continuation of those colonial sort of trends, even if it's Eddie Murphy and Hollywood, it's still there. So as I say, that was more of a sort of observation really than anything else.
I would like to add maybe just something small. It's the question we like to ask where those blankets are concerned, or I particularly like to ask, is what did that blanket replace? And that's where the work then starts to begin.
Great. So I know that there are quite a few hands. So can we go to that? Hannah, help me. Who is the next one?
I think it was Matthew next in the list.
Okay, Matthew.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting. I mean, I think the same. I sort of share some of Harriet's thoughts about this concept of disruption, which is one of my least favorite words. But I mean, I think the tradition of disruption in much of Africa is a long-standing tradition in so many different ways. And it means different things to different people. But there's this definitely, I would say, a tradition of a kind of richness of irony, particularly in fashion, but other aspects of urban culture, especially with regard to appropriation and satire, which I think is very much embedded in not just the new extremities of Afrofuturism. I mean, we have this amazing show by Zanele Mahole at the Tate, Britain at the moment, but also a long tradition of ironic appropriation that is mixed with a kind of sophistication, whether in the kind of tongue-in-cheek bourgeois stuff that you get in South African culture, not just fashion, but other aspects of South African culture, or, you know, a much more long-standing tradition in high life in Nigeria and West Africa. And I don't think that, I mean, in a lot of the kind of language of racial equity and so on, that is, of course, sweeping the world now, there seems to be a desire to iron out a lot of the appropriation tactics that are very much part of this authentic tradition to me. And I just wonder what, from a fashion point of view, you think the future holds. Is it very much a future for Africans to be able to continue to appropriate and manipulate external perceptions from an ironic perspective? Or do you think that there's likely to be a kind of evening out and ironing out that might take the edge off some of those tactics and practices?
Erica or Lesiba, would you like to respond to that?
Maybe I should, but yeah, it's very interesting that you say in terms of context of Africa, we're always kind of seen as ourselves as disruption. But I was just thinking, and as I was writing it down, pure existence, our pure existence is disruption. Just to be alive and you know, I write on my Instagram handle is souvenir of conflict, because there is so much conflict with just me being where I am. And in terms of questioning all the things that I'm able to gain access to, which is whether it is clothing, whether it is this online webinar, how we conduct ourselves, the fact that this is an academic sort of platform, the ways that I'm meant to speak. So there are many areas that, you know, you have to start to question, and things that you kind of see in the everyday. And that's the thing that kind of gave me that sort of lens of understanding after doing performance studies. And I'm very fortunate to have done that, because, you know, prior to that, it was just a fashion sort of lens, and it was very much an artistic application. But through understanding performance theory, you then understand how the body relates to the fabric. And that's one of the most important elements that I think is not taught in institutions of higher learning. The other thing is then, I guess the question for us is always, does appropriation easily translate itself into progress? And that's what has been, I think, the problem for quite a long time, in terms of considering this idea of, you know, or troubling the idea of wearing particular types of suits, or celebrating a particular idea of subculture, is that, you know, a lot of Africans themselves kind of see that as an idea of, you know, traditions move forward. Why should we always look back? But I think it's important that we know what came before we move forward. And the task that is laid out in front of us is difficult, because colonialism was difficult. Decoloniality will be even harder. And we're talking about multiple traumas as well that kind of bring through those ideas of, you know, appropriation. And a lot of the work that I've been working on is this idea of not so much mimicry, because that's maybe it's a bit of a deep sort of space that I'm trying to go into, but it's this thing of passing, you know, the way that I wear my clothes can gain me access into a specific space, but at the same time, it can also, you know, highlight or communicate in non-verbal means where I would like to go. And a lot of our experience, because where we come from, or not majority, but not all of us, but, you know, our experiences or our lived experiences are so dire that, you know, we would rather show where we would like to go in our dress. And so those, the Sapiers, the Skotan, the Swanka movements kind of all relate to that. But in many ways, I'm very interested in the connection, not so much the difference. And this is something that I'm trying to explore, the idea of spirituality like music, where you don't have to be from South Africa. You could be from the Dominican, but because purely from our historical backgrounds or connected sort of historical backgrounds, we can listen to a piece of music that was produced in South Africa by, say, South Africans, and say you're from the Dominican Republic, and you get it. And I'm trying to see whether there's that sort of link within fashion as well. That, you know, you can be from the Ghanaian sort of area, and, you know, find that sort of semblance within the United States, for instance. So what is that thread? What is that spirit? And, you know, a lot of that kind of brings me back to this idea of the appreciation of negative space. Obviously, there's a concept from the Far East, so it's not necessarily specifically in Japan or located in Japan, but it makes me think around, you know, concepts or birthing of concepts, and where do those birthings emanate from, and can we find that, or can we write about that through our visual sort of inquiry? I don't know if you want to say anything, Erica.
Thanks very much.
Erica, you're mute.
Thank you, Lesiba, just for taking the time just to answer that. I'm quite aware that we are close to the hour. Wessie, you know, I think it was a really rich response. I'm not sure if you want to ask some more questions or get some more questions, or how.
I'm aware of the time because we're already off. So, but obviously these are hens which has been up for quite some time. So what I would do is I would invite them to give us just one sentence. I mean, it could be a question or maybe one comment. We collect it, so we may not have the time, but then I think the conversation can go beyond that. It's my mistake as well, because at one point when we were talking about having these sessions, and we were saying that whether we should have it for an hour or an hour and a half, and actually now I know that we need more time. But anyway, we will go forward to another audience question. So this is Chauncey Ibi. We have Chauncey Ibi, and then afterwards Nicholas Cambridge. So Chauncey. You're mute. You are mute. You have to switch on your microphone. And please one line. Yes.
Just one line.
One line. Yes, please.
Oh, decolonizing passion in museums is what I've heard of it recently, and I just wondered whether people like you, Erica, and everyone else that's spoken have been approached by people that are talking about decolonizing, and how your research, everyone that's spoken, your research, what is your ultimate goal in terms of curriculum? Is your ultimate goal, or one of your ultimate goals, to approach curriculums and see if that can change people, the approach in education? I've got a lot more questions, but I guess I can't.
Okay, that's already that's great. I mean, well, that would incur long answers, but I come back to your questions. We'll address your question, but can I collect Nicholas' questions at the same time? Nicholas. Thank you, Chelsea. Nicholas, are you here? Okay, Nicholas may be gone for lunch a bit. His hand is still up, but let's. Oh, hi, Nicholas. So we're collecting your either feedback or question as well. Please go ahead.
It's going to be the feedback, not the question. Japanese designers were mentioned, and as we saw the film, I was thinking exactly that. Japanese have done this sort of 40 years ago, and I'm wondering if you think the Western suit as a garment sort of so deeply entrenched in fashion culture, like an immovable object, that it needs confronting with irresistible force on a sort of regular basis. And if so, how does your approach sort of differ from the other deconstructionists who have done something similar?
Good question. Thank you. Right. Okay. So either of you, Erica or Lesiba, would you like to address that? And again, 2 lines, max 2 lines.
Well, I think let me just reply very briefly just to Chuxi's comments. And I really do appreciate the kind of scale and scope of at which levels decolonization needs to happen, and from the curriculum, which is a really sort of private space with students, but into the world of work in which they then find themselves, which is then sort of driven by media, by brands, by fashion houses, by fashion sort of dominant voices, and then extending even beyond that into things like museum spaces, which archive and strengthen and support very particular kinds of narratives. So the kind of flow of decolonial work, and I think in your very short sort of questions, you probably had all the sub-questions that sort of span that entire context of where decolonial work needs to happen. And so yes, it is in our interest, and we understand the scope of the work that we, working with one small project at a time. But we are very aware of the threads that reach right across into other spectrums. So not to take up more time, but we're definitely open to more conversations, and you can visit our website. Wesley, you're on mute. Yep.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
Can I just respond about the curriculum as well in one line? Is James here?
Okay, James, very quickly, because we're running out of
my
time.
one line is,
one line.
Yes,
please.
I do. My idea for the curriculum is knocking down the academic regulations which are excluding people, no matter how we recognise the individual. They come up against colonial preconditions of success and failure. So it's looking at that and changing that. And the digital difference through COVID is beginning to crumble those walls, because now it's a global perspective which students can access, which is giving people voices they never had before. That's my line, one line.
Thank you, James. That's very helpful. And I wonder either of you want to address Nicola's questions on Japanese fashion and the suit and deconstruction.
Yeah, I think one of the things with this idea of decolonial theories or stories or whatever that we're doing is that decolonial means multiple stories and not necessarily one story. And that the idea that, Japanese have kind of done it 40 years ago, absolutely, we acknowledge that, but it was specific to Japan. And that kind of gives a sort of background to the idea, or to why I kind of went through it, was that I was addressing issues of masculinities within myself as an African. And I previously worked with blankets, and blankets were kind of signified a lot of masculine issues of identity within South Africa, specifically issues of initiation. And so there's a process of you going to the mountain, you go through the rites of passage, and then afterwards you wear a suit. I was troubling that idea of why we wear suits after going through the process of initiation. And that was my the starting agency into that inquiry. And obviously the Japanese have done it before, and therefore I have to kind of mention them. It's nothing new, but the story is new.
Great. Okay. I am looking at the time, so obviously very much appreciate the audience staying with us, but we do need to close the session. I'm not sure I can go with you, Harriet, unless that your is one word. Well, obviously, some of you who ask questions, you can contact Erica and Lesiba as well. For further discussion, so very welcome. I suppose our speaker will be very welcomed to receive your email. But at this end, I really want to thank you, all our speakers, for such an engaging and stimulating session, and also demonstrating all these sort of passionate subjects, matters. Thank you so much, Erica, Lesiba, James, and Kevin. We have to give you a round of applause. And I also want to thank the audience for joining us. We are running out of time, very unprofessional this round, but we also do not want to miss out all these stimulating discussion. And also, thank you so much for joining us and staying till the end. But we also have 3 more sessions scheduled in the following Thursday within the same series. So please check them out and register via our website. Next week's event is running in conjunction with our University Centers for Global Diversities and Inequalities, our seminar on economic femininity and gender violence. We bring Professor Kate McLean at Northumbria University and Dr. Maria Lopez at the Global Diversity and Inequality Center. And this will be on Thursday next week at 5:30 to 7 p.m. So please join us there. So for now, I would say goodbye and thank you once again for all of you joining us. See you next week.
Thank you, Wessie. Thank you, everybody.